I made a decision 3 months ago that has reshaped my relationship with my primary computer, and the specific experience of that decision is the subject of this video. I deleted Windows from my main machine. Not dual booted, not set up a secondary partition, not virtualized. I formatted the entire drive, installed Linux, and have not booted Windows since. The machine I used for this is not new. It is a 4-year-old laptop that had been running Windows 11 since the point where Microsoft pushed the upgrade from Windows 10. It was slowing down, struggling with the background services that modern Windows runs, and generally feeling tired in the way that laptops do as they accumulate years of use. After 3 months on Linux, the machine feels new, not figuratively, literally in terms of specific measurable characteristics. The boot time is faster, the application launches are quicker. The battery life is longer, the fans run less, the system is quieter. The machine responds to my inputs without the occasional hesitation that Windows had developed. The transformation is substantial enough that it is worth describing in detail because the experience I had is probably replicable for many users with similar hardware and similar frustrations. Let me start with what the machine was doing before the switch. The laptop is a ThinkPad with what was a mid-range configuration when I bought it. 8-core processor, 16 gigabytes of memory, 500 gigabytes solid-state drive, integrated graphics with a modest discrete option. The hardware was adequate for the work I was doing, which included a mix of development, writing, media consumption, and communication. Nothing unusual, nothing particularly demanding. Before the switch, the machine had developed a set of annoyances that had accumulated gradually. Boot time had grown from under 20 seconds when the machine was new to close to a minute. Applications launched more slowly than they used to. The fans would spin up during routine activity that had not previously required active cooling. The battery life had dropped from about 6 hours of mixed use to about 3.5 hours. The machine felt, in the ways that are hard to quantify but very noticeable in daily use, tired. I had tried the standard Windows optimizations. I had disabled services that I did not need. I had uninstalled software I was not using. I had cleaned up the startup programs. I had run the disk cleanup tools. The effect of these optimizations was marginal. The machine was slightly better after the optimizations than before, but it was still substantially worse than it had been when new. The Windows infrastructure that had accumulated on the machine through years of updates and integrations was imposing overhead that specific tweaks could not fully address. I had been considering the switch to Linux for some months. The immediate trigger was a Windows update that installed several new integrations I had not asked for, including a new AI feature that I specifically did not want. The update prompted me for configuration and the act of having to actively decline features that I had not requested was the moment that crystallized my decision. If I had to fight Windows to keep it configured the way I wanted, I would rather use an operating system that was not trying to push features on me. I chose Linux Mint as my distribution. The choice was based on Linux Mint's reputation for user-friendliness, its Cinnamon desktop environment that felt familiar after years of Windows, and its track record for stability. Other distributions would have worked. Mint happened to be the one I chose. The installation took about 40 minutes, including backup of files I wanted to preserve. I used the Mint installer to wipe the drive and install Mint as the only operating system. The installation went smoothly, with the installer correctly detecting my hardware and configuring the appropriate drivers. After the installation, the first boot was dramatically faster than Windows had been. The machine went from power on to usable desktop in about 12 seconds. This was faster than the machine had ever booted under Windows, including when it was new. The specific reason is that Linux Mint runs far fewer services at startup than Windows does, and the services it runs are more efficient. Over the next 3 months, I migrated my workflow to Linux. The specific migration was less disruptive than I had expected. Most of the applications I used daily had direct Linux equivalents or were available on Linux natively. Firefox, LibreOffice, Thunderbird, VLC, GIMP, Inkscape, and VS Code all work on Linux the same way they work on Windows. Some applications required workarounds, a few I replaced with different tools. One or two I ran through Wine when I needed them. The specific observations about the machine's behavior over the 3 months have been consistent. Boot time has remained at about 12 seconds. Windows, toward the end of my use, had been taking about 60 seconds. The 5-fold improvement is not an exaggeration, it is a precisely measurable difference. Application launch times are substantially shorter. Firefox, which had been taking about 5 seconds to launch on Windows, now launches in under 2 seconds on Linux. Other applications show similar improvements. The cumulative effect is that the machine feels more responsive throughout the day. Battery life has improved from about 3.5 hours to about 5.5 hours of the same mixed workload. The difference is about 60% more runtime on the same battery. The specific reasons are a combination of reduced background activity, more efficient CPU scheduling, and better power management in the Linux drivers for my hardware. Fan activity has dropped substantially. The fans rarely spin up for routine activity. When they do spin up, it is during tasks that would have triggered fan activity on any operating system, like compilation of large code bases or video encoding. The ambient fan noise during typical use is near zero, where it had been a constant low-level presence on Windows. System responsiveness, in the sense of how quickly the machine responds to inputs, is better. The occasional delays that Windows had developed, where the machine would pause for a second or two before responding to a click or a keystroke, have gone away. The machine responds to inputs immediately. Storage use has dropped. Windows had accumulated about 120 gigabytes of system files over its years of use. Linux Mint uses about 30 gigabytes for the system plus whatever my user data occupies. The storage freed up for my own use was substantial. Memory use has dropped. Windows idle was using about 5 to 6 gigabytes of memory for system services. Linux Mint idle uses about 1.5 gigabytes. The memory freed up for active use has made a noticeable difference for memory-intensive workloads. The overall impression is of a machine that is performing at or above the level it was at when it was new. The decline in performance that I had attributed to the machine being old had been, in substantial part, decline in Windows performance on the machine, which the switch to Linux reversed entirely. There have been some specific issues over the 3 months. Printer setup took some troubleshooting. A specific webcam that I use for video calls needed a driver adjustment. Certain web services treat Linux as a suspicious user agent and require additional verification. None of these issues was severe. Each was resolved with a specific workaround. The cumulative friction of the switch, measured in hours, has been maybe 10 to 15 hours total over the 3 months, with most of that being in the first 2 weeks. The broader lesson I draw from this experience is that the performance decline that many users attribute to their aging hardware is, in substantial part, not really about the hardware at all. The hardware is mostly fine. The operating system's accumulated overhead is the main cause of the decline. A 4-year-old laptop that struggles on Windows can perform like a new laptop on Linux because the Linux environment imposes less overhead on the same hardware. This insight is worth something to users who are considering whether to replace their hardware. For a user in the position I was in, the decision to replace the hardware would have cost substantial money. A comparable new laptop would have been a 4-figure purchase. The decision to install Linux cost nothing in money and a manageable amount of time. The outcome, in terms of the experience of using the machine, was comparable to what I would have gotten from a new machine. This is a remarkable value proposition for anyone willing to accept the specific requirements of Linux as an operating system. The specific requirements are worth acknowledging. Linux requires a willingness to learn. Linux requires some tolerance for occasional troubleshooting. Linux requires finding alternatives to some Windows-specific applications. For users who are not willing to accept these requirements, Linux is not the right choice. For users who are willing to accept them, Linux offers a path to making existing hardware feel new again at approximately zero cost. Subscribe for the next video, which describes the specific tools and workflows I use after 3 months of Linux-only daily driving, including the applications that replaced my Windows tools, the configurations that make the experience smooth, and the specific places where I still encounter friction. And in the comments, if you have had a similar experience with Linux and older hardware, tell me what you observed. The accumulated stories of users making the switch are, I think, one of the best evidence sources for whether the switch is worth it.